Hello and welcome to the Project Merlin podcast series, where we're uncovering some of the darkest secrets in Britain's history. I'm Jon Hogg, reader in 20th century history from the University of Liverpool.
And I'm investigative journalist Susie Boniface. Together we are delving into the biggest ever declassification of nuclear records to get closer to the truth that lies behind decades of government cover-up. Now, we should say that all the views that are expressed in this podcast are those of the individuals concerned and not necessarily the University of Liverpool. Anyway.
So we're running a project with the Centre for People's Justice at the University of Liverpool, co-designed with Lab Rats and Susie. And really it's to facilitate a better understanding of the Merlin database and to create a catalogue of it. And we're doing this with a whole group of student volunteers. In our first episode, we talked about the Merlin database, how it came to be discovered by Susie, and then how it was later released by government. We talked to two descendants last week, Alan Owen and Steve Peirce, and we uncovered new documentation that connected those two men and their families with bombs and contamination that were 4,000 miles apart. And this is really what we're finding on Merlin. We're finding kind of snippets and fragments about the nuclear test programme that really start to reveal and unravel sort of new understandings of this period of history. So if you haven't heard those episodes, we really recommend that you go back and have a listen.
Yeah, they're great fun. Now, today, our guests are two people at either end of the academic research that's being done into the Cold War and this weapons programme. So we have Chris Hill, Associated Professor in History from the University of South Wales, and Alice Shadbolt, who's one of the students helping us here in Liverpool combing through this big pile of 28,000 documents. Welcome, both of you.
Hi, Susie.
Now, before we get stuck in, you've both done a bit of work previously on the veterans of these nuclear tests. So, Alice, can you tell us a little bit about the dissertation that you've done, why you got involved in the Merlin project?
Yeah, so I first heard about Britain's nuclear testing programme when I was at university, and it really struck me, I think, because it wasn't a period of history that I hadn't encountered before. It was a very specific part of it that had been overshadowed by kind of focus on politics and the arms race and things. And so I became really interested in why that erasure had happened, and being given the opportunity to work on the Merlin project has been amazing, both to try and help veterans gain some clarity and fight against that marginalisation, but also to see how the government shaped what kind of counts as nuclear knowledge through archives. And that's really what I focused on in my dissertation. So I've looked at how both veterans and the government weaponize archives against each other to try and control the narrative of nuclear harm. And we kind of see this meta conflict emerge. So essentially a conflict over the conflict, where blame and victimhood and narrative are all contested in the present. And the outcomes of that struggle, whether that be the release of the Merlin files or oral history work like John and Chris's project, are kind of constantly reshaping that evidentiary terrain and our understanding of nuclear history today.
So Alice, you also interviewed a nuclear test veteran or two?
Yeah. And that really kind of emphasised the human aspect of all this, I think, and how veterans are literally having to actively write themselves back into this history and fight against that marginalisation from the bottom up.
Okay, thank you very much. And so we'll turn now to Professor Chris Hill. And Chris, you and me have worked together recently on an oral history project that you led from the University of South Wales. So would you like to say a little bit about your own kind of expertise and background?
Yeah, I mean, similar to Alice, really, my sort of understanding of nuclear history began to emerge during my undergraduate at the University of St Andrews, where I was taught by Professor Jerry de Groot, who carried out an interview with the physicist Hans Bethe. And if you remember the Oppenheimer film, Hans Bethe was a physicist who basically says at one point before the Trinity detonation, we don't know whether the chain of fission will continue exponentially and blow up the world. So hearing that kind of story as an undergraduate immediately caught my interest. And in a similar manner to Alice, who I thought really eloquently described the mechanics of how nuclear knowledge is produced, nuclear weapons and their detonation represent something of a kind of paradox, because they are sensational and iconic and very visible and sublime, yet the politics that goes on behind them is secretive. And of course, the Cold War was a secretive conflict. So I thought Alice spoke very well there about some of the mechanics behind how nuclear knowledge is produced, and also referenced the idea of veterans struggling for visibility themselves, nuclear test veterans, the men who participated in these testing operations, often in what were for them very far-flung places. Many of these men were in their late teens and had barely left the county that they were born in, let alone go abroad, and let alone go abroad to the other side of the world, to Australia, the Australian test sites, or to the Pacific. So yes, John, we worked very closely, didn't we, in partnership with the British Library, in simply systematically documenting the voices of British nuclear test veterans. Oral histories have been conducted before with those veterans, but creating an open access archive where researchers, journalists, students can listen and learn from test veterans themselves and humanize some of the experience of the Cold War, I felt was a very important undertaking, and I'm really proud of the work that we did on that together.
Yeah. Now, I'm very interested. I think I'm going to remember the phrase that you came up with, Alice, of meta conflict, because that makes perfect sense with some of the stuff that we've been doing with the nuclear veterans in the campaign. I mean, I remember a long time people have been talking about, fighting for the nuclear veterans and fighting for this, because the Mirror that I used to write for has been doing this for 20 years. And I've said to everybody, it's not a fight. A fight is something you have outside a pub when you're pissed off with somebody else. What we're in is a war. And with a war, there are repeated battles, there are losses. You take a hit along the way. Not everyone makes it to the end. You need lots of generals, you need air support, you need submarines, you need everything. And it's a longer, more difficult way of getting your head around what it is that we're trying to do. But meta conflict just about covers it, I think, a lot quicker. Now, very quickly for our listener, if you haven't heard episode 1, I suggest you go back and do so, because it would make my life a lot easier if you did. But just to quickly put the Merlin project into some perspective for you. Now, imagine the night sky dotted with thousands and thousands of stars. Now, imagine that is a spreadsheet, right? And every star has its own little row. And every star appears to have been misrecorded, badly catalogued, unnoticed in the first place. And it's your job, dear listener, to enter in all the data for every single star. Give it a name, give it a date, what it's made of, how relevant it is, how it interacts with all the other stars. That's what decoding the Merlin database is like. It's a mammoth task, and in each episode of our podcast we're going to focus on one particular star, one file, in the hope that it helps illuminate some of the rest of it, but perhaps a faint hope, but there we are. That's what we're going to try to do. And every week our students get together and go through that spreadsheet, don't they, John?
Yeah, and it's been challenging, because what we call the metadata, the kind of broad information that comes with the files, is often quite sparse. So really the students are doing brilliant work kind of filling in those gaps, and we're trying to create a catalogue that essentially will offer much richer, fuller information to the nuclear community. And it's slow work, because we're using eyes and brains. And I think really what we found so far is that we're finding really interesting pieces of information. It might just be a sentence within a large 60-page report, for instance. And like Susie said, these are kind of fragments and bits and pieces, and we're slowly sort of putting together, I think, new understandings of the nuclear past. And the document we're going to talk about today, it was just one of those little moments, like Susie said, early in the project. A student found this quite unusual document that mentioned a 50 megaton weapon. So I think I seem to remember Susie and I kind of went over and had a little look at this. And then, Susie, we sort of tried to make sense of what we were reading, didn't we?
Yeah, because we both went, a 50 megaton bomb, that's massive. What? And we didn't, when you talk about things like this, when it's in history, when there's the document, they usually give things different names, they describe things in different ways. It took us a while, I think, to figure out and remember there was only one 50 megaton bomb in all of human history. Now, for the listener, 50 megatons, that is a lot. It is a lot of bomb, okay? So 1 megaton is 1,000 kilotons, which in itself, every kiloton is 1,000 tons of TNT. That's the equivalent. So the bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were between 20 and 15 kilotons, 20 or 15,000 tons of TNT, equivalent to that kind of Big Bang. So what the student had found in this document that mentioned a 50 megaton bomb was information about a weapon that was 50,000 kilotons. That is 2,500 times what was used in Japan, 2,500 times what killed hundreds of thousands of people, 2,500 times what ended the Second World War. Well, it may or may not already have been over at that point, but that's a whole different podcast there. But it's a big bomb.
Yeah, and there was only one bomb that big. It was what became known as the Tsar Bomb, that was detonated October the 30th, 1961. And for some reason then, this document was in the Merlin archive, kept secret for 65 years, which is now publicly available through the National Archives. Recently, the Russian government released some footage. Obviously, it's a bit different if you're watching on video, but we'll try to explain it as we go, and you can have a look at this video.
Basically, guys, it's just it's a Soviet government film about the Tsar Bomber. There's some Russian explanation of what's going on. There's a Russian countdown, and then there's a Big Bang. It's not too complicated. But before we go on to what the document said, I mean, Chris, perhaps you and John can give us a bit of background here as the pet historians. Why did the Russians, because this was the Soviets set off this weapon at a time in the arms race when, the America and Russia were both arguing about getting into space and who had the biggest willy and whatever. Why on earth did Russia have a bomb this big, and why did they need it? Why did they fire it?
Well, it was a last-ditch effort before the Limited Test Ban Treaty to test their most powerful weapon. The weapon, I think, was actually designed initially to be 100 megatons rather than 50. But yeah, they did think that the radioactive fallout from a 100 megaton bomb, twice the size of the 50,000 kilotons which you were mentioning, something like 2,500 to 3,000 times of the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. They did think that might be a bit too much, so they cut it down to 50,000. Of course, with that scale of detonation, it's absolutely huge. And I think when we come to the document, we'll be talking about what that meant in terms of fallout, because if you search it on Google and you will look at basic images that try to capture the scale of the Tsar Bomba, they are the scale of it, the size of it, the magnitude is like nothing else that was detonated during the Cold War. It goes so high up into the atmosphere, and it's effectively a global bomb. It's detonated from a peninsula in Siberia, a place called Novaya Zemlya. But yes, it took place in the context of diplomatic negotiations around disarmament, which ironically then accelerated the need to test weapons. And of course, once the Russians have tested Tsar Bomba, there is a response from the British and Americans, well, led by the Americans, who think we also need to test our technologies and do more atmospheric testing before the Limited Test Ban Treaty then bans atmospheric testing altogether for those who sign up to it, which is not everyone.
Because there was a bit of paranoia as well around anti-ballistic missile technology as well. So these high altitude missiles, apparently Khrushchev said something along the lines of we could hit a fly in space if we wanted to. So this idea that nuclear weapon, deterrence could kind of be harmed by the rise of anti-missile technology as well. So it's a sort of mixture of paranoia coming in here. But, the irony is as well that the Tsar Bomber was never deliverable. It was just too large. But so it was more like Chris said, that sort of demonstration of might. So the Soviets seemed very keen on that as a response to perceived American sort of heightened rhetoric in that Cold War era. It's interesting as well, actually, in the UK context. Higuchi, in his book Political Fallout, talks about there were actually plans once people realised that the Tsar Bomba was going to happen, because Khrushchev actually announced it before it was going to happen, which is very unusual in the Cold War. There were plans to advise all families to only give their babies dried milk, so not to actually use milk that was fresh. But these plans were later shelved. So it's interesting, sort of behind the scenes, that the UK government was already thinking, "Wow, this is going to be potentially quite serious."
But back up a minute to something that Chris said. You said that the talks about disarmament kind of led to the creation of the detonation of this absolutely massive bomb. Can you explain that in simple dot to dot for an idiot like me? How does the suggestion that we need to stop detonating these things because they're big and scary and frightening lead to someone detonating the biggest and scariest and the most frightening of all?
Yeah, I think it's the notion that because there is a cutoff in which you can test these technologies, that your window of opportunity is decreasing. And as that window of opportunity decreases, your time to test the new technology, and in this case, the world's largest ever bomb, is also decreasing. And so the Soviets are rushing, therefore, to get it in before the limited test ban treaty, or the partial test ban treaty, as it's called, is concluded.
Oh, right. So the sense is really they're running out of time to show that you can do this, and that once the treaty comes in and there's no more explosions, you'd need to have, you need to be in a strong position so everyone knows what you're capable of, and this is the best we can do, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think this idea of the bomb as a demonstration, as an illustration of power, they become almost iconic, don't they? And symbolic within the context of the Cold War about who has got the most power. And of course, ever since the Russians put Sputnik in space, the Americans have this sort of collective anxiety about the fact that this has happened, because it goes back to missile technology. And if you put a satellite in space, you can develop an intercontinental ballistic missile. And so you see the situation where it goes back and forth with bigger and bigger bombs, or more powerful bombs being detonated. And I think you're right, Susie, when you used the gendered kind of expression metaphor to summarize what's going on here. And lots of critical feminist scholars have looked at it from that perspective, beginning perhaps with a famous essay by a woman called Carol Cohn in the 1980s, where she actually decides to go on a disarmament training course. No, not disarmament. She becomes part of a nuclear think tank. And using linguistic studies, she begins to unpack the language and how that's connected to policy. And the language is so heavily laden with phallic references. And that becomes the kind of classic way of seeing the Cold War. But the arms race does very much seem to capture the idea of a dick measuring contest between the USSR and the USA. And yeah, the Tsar Bomba, if you like, was the last opportunity before the window closed for one last big demonstration of power.
Before you had to zip back up again. There's me thinking I was being crude, and actually I was being a critical feminist thinker. Thank you. Right, that's why we invited you on, Chris. So what Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, actually said in the run-up to detonating this weapon was, "We have said that we have a 100 megaton bomb. This is true, but we're not going to explode it, because even if we did so at the most remote site, we might knock out all our windows. May God grant, as they used to say, that we're never called upon to explode these bombs over anybody's territory. This is the greatest wish of our lives." So he's sort of saying, I want to be terribly safe, because these things are very dangerous, but I am going to let one off just to show you that I can, which is mad. So there's this massive bomb. Everyone knew it was going to go off. Like you said, John, they told people they were going to do it, probably because firstly, they were never going to get away with pretending they hadn't, let's face it. And they wanted people to know they were doing it. It was the whole point. But I suppose the whole world was just waiting to see if the Soviets would actually be able to do it, or whether it would just sort of fizzle out and not work.
Yeah, that's correct. And I'd really like to turn to Alice now, actually, and maybe we just get to the document and have a look what's in there. So, Alice, would you, when you saw this document, what kind of analysis, what kind of reflection did you come up with?
Yeah, I think it's interesting how quickly they moved to just kind of minimizing any sense of danger. Because Dr. Cohen, who worked for the Ministry of Defence, he's asserting that most of the yield would have gone into the upper atmosphere and that it presented no immediate hazard to the UK. But all of this is being said before they've got the results of the samples being analysed. And I think the fact that they were taking samples shows that they did have some kind of uncertainty about the effect of it and were working out where this radiation was going. And I think this is a pattern that you see across the Merlin files and just government documentation in general, where the state just kind of authoritatively claims and dismisses any sense of risk and maps radiation as something that behaves and follows really neat, predictable lines that can be controlled and contained. And this framing really preempts any claims of wrongdoing, and how quickly they shift to then managing public perception of that. It demonstrates that the focus really is on, controlling these narratives, controlling how harm is understood and communicated and defined. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I suppose what you're talking about there, the very controlled, calm government line of this is fine. We know how it's working. There's a straight line we can draw between X and Y. It's all just a mathematical equation. That's sort of in direct contrast to how popular culture was dealing with it, which was panic. Oh my God. And sort of the unknowns and everything else that was going on. I mean, John, you've written a book about nuclear culture. How does what Alice was talking about there, about the nice, calm, controlled government line, was that perhaps a sensible, it's in the public interest for us to just dial this down a bit, kind of a sane response perhaps to all the uncertainty that was broiling away in the media and stuff at the time?
Yeah, and it seems that was the thinking behind the dried milk or fresh milk sort of dilemma, that in the end there was a decision not to go to dried milk because it would scare everyone. So you create paranoia. So instead you put out official narratives, unostentatious, as it says in the report, unostentatiously through normal channels. So just to really play things down, I suppose, to downplay any sense of any risk to yourself or your family. And this goes all the way back to kind of early civil defence plans in the years after World War II, early Cold War. A lot of this it's kind of a soft propaganda, and it's about kind of convincing and reassuring people about their own safety. And also it kind of protects the nuclear order in a sense as well. So you don't start protesting against nuclear weapons because, you're constantly told it's okay, you're safe. The global situation is containable, it's fine. So I think it all plays into that kind of narrative, if you like.
Yeah, and the idea you don't want to avoid panic on the streets and everything else. So let's just introduce this document first then. So this is one of the things we found on Merlin. It is a cabinet office. It's a memo from a meeting in the cabinet office in a committee that had been hurriedly convened to discuss the detonation of the Tsar Bomba weapon. The title of the committee was Fallout from Nuclear Explosions, Hazards to Human Health, which is the reason why it was gathered on the Merlin database for use in a later negligence court case, because it would have demonstrated what level of internal knowledge, institutional government knowledge there was about radiation injury, perhaps. It's the minutes of a meeting held in the Minister of Housing's office in Whitehall on the 1st of November 1961. So what's that, 2 days after the detonation. People are present are the Minister for Housing. You've got the someone who was the PR advisor to the Prime Minister at the time. Which one was it? John, Chris, Macmillan? Are we talking about?
Yeah, Macmillan. And it was Charles Hill, unrelated, I should add.
Oh, yeah.
We've got someone from the Department of Health, people from the Ministry of Defence, people from we've got top brass, we've got people from the Min of Ag and Fish, as it used to be known, Agriculture and Fisheries, and the Medical Research Council, which was involved in research on what was happening to human health as a result of atmospheric testing. There is only 2 items on the agenda. Number 1, fallout from the 50 megaton bomb, and number 2 was the proposed government statement. And then it's a very short document. There's just a little explanation here about Dr. Cohen and what he says about the fallout. Alice, can you perhaps take us through some of the detail there? What does Dr. Cohen say that the fallout risk is?
Yeah, I mean, he essentially says that they don't think that there will be any, but then does acknowledge that there are radioactive clouds moving over Iceland and Scotland. So, yeah, he very much takes the line of this is not a problem.
Yeah, he seems to say that there is fallout, and by the same, there is a radioactive cloud, but there won't be any fallout in it, which is
it's very
kind of an odd. It's kind of an odd thing. So he says that the cloud that went up would have gone into the upper atmosphere. So we can probably show a diagram at this stage for our viewers on video. But for those who are listening on audio, if you have an atomic weapon, one of the smaller ones, like the ones dropped in Japan, they're going to explode in what's known as the tropopause, which is sort of the area of atmosphere that goes up to about twice the height of a modern airliner. And above that, you get the stratosphere and other bit, and then eventually space. Okay, but hydrogen weapons, thermonuclear weapons, they explode much higher. They're much bigger bangs, and they happen further up in the stratosphere. So the assumption is that when you get a really big bang, unlike what happened in Japan, the clouds are going to go up so high, and the stratospheric winds that go around the world much higher, never affect us down here. They're going to take that cloud and deposit it harmlessly around the globe, and it'll never really fall to Earth. And if it does, it'll be in so many varied places that you'll never kind of notice it. And so Dr. Cohen is saying, look, where it's the bottom of the cloud that is going to move over North Iceland and might reach the north of Scotland on the evening of the 3rd of November and subsequently cover the entire British Isles. What he doesn't say in here, interestingly, is that the bottom bit of the cloud, the stem of the mushroom, is the bit you'd expect to see the most radiation in normally, Chris. I mean, when you saw the document, what did you think about Dr. Cohen's suggestions on the fallout?
Yeah, I was skeptical. Because I mean, it's my understanding, I'm by no means a physicist or anybody who's got any understanding of the kind of atmospheric physics of nuclear detonation. I think it's important to add that the Tsar Bomba was detonated mid-air. You can learn quite a lot from looking at some of the photographs of the detonations, because if you think about some of the ones from the mid-50s, say in Bikini Atoll, you have the very thick trunk on the mushroom cloud, and those are the kind of almost classic exoticized sublime photos of bombs, and that's because that's actually detonated in the lagoon, so it's pulling up everything into it. Whereas the Tsar Bomba, yes, was detonated mid-air, and yet no evidence is really provided to sort of back up or substantiate this suggestion about how the radionuclides are being dispersed within the cloud itself. So suggesting that they have gone into the upper atmosphere, they will have been propelled upwards, of course, and that is what makes this such a significant historic turning point, because it is, I think, the most vivid demonstration of nuclear testing as a global phenomenon that's going to affect everybody, because the force of the bomb is propelling radionuclides upwards. Those are going to be dispersed on a planetary basis. But yes, I think we can safely say that, of course, there will be harmful fallout in the base of the clouds as well. And those clouds are traveling swiftly towards Iceland and Scotland, according to the documents.
Yeah, and that's sort of in the opposite direction to where you normally expect the winds to go. So normally winds will come off the Atlantic, or the surface winds come off the Atlantic and push everything north up towards the pole. But in this particular instance, the cloud is moving in the opposite direction. It's coming from Novaya Zemlya up in the Arctic Sea down towards Scotland, past Sweden, past Finland, past Norway, and coming down towards us. And that would perhaps imply that it's on the stratospheric winds, a level above the surface winds, and they do tend to go in opposite directions sometime and crisscross over each other. So it seems, John, that the government was under the impression, this is Dr. Cohen from the Ministry of Defence was telling this committee that a harmless bit of the cloud might reach Britain, but they seem to be unaware that it could be toxic.
Yeah, and I think we talked in the last episode when we talked about the Maralinga Health Survey about the sort of level of uncertainty coming through the report. And I think we see a similar thing here. There's a sort of authoritative tone. about, this is the way to proceed, this is the way to talk to the public. But underlying that is a level of uncertainty, isn't there? I think about actually what this cloud is, as Chris said, where it will be, how dangerous it will be. So it's all the uncertainty. And I think when you're dealing with a weapon of this size, that's obviously going to disperse a lot of material over very long distances, it's that kind of level of uncertainty that really strikes me. But again, we see a very authoritative statement. So although behind the scenes there were concerns about milk, in Hansard, 24 days later, I'll just quote the official line: "The government is satisfied that no special measures are necessary to protect the health of any section of the population from the fallout from nuclear weapons that have so far been exploded. Milk throughout the country is safe for children of all ages. The government will maintain its readiness its plans to give the public ample warning if danger threatens in the future, and to provide safe milk for babies should the need ever arise." So there's that real sort of awareness that, the levels of strontium-90 being found in babies' teeth in North America, for example, the scientific surveys went on in the late 1950s. There's a sort of awareness of this public anxiety around the potential for radiation exposure here. And I think the source we found, like I said, displays a level of uncertainty and not quite knowing, but then we see that official line being very sort of certain about how to proceed.
Yeah, as a journalist, there's stuff here that just makes me this just makes my hackles stand up. You've waited more than 3 weeks to make an official statement in Hansard, number one. What? The flash from Tsar Bomba was seen 3,000 miles away in Greenland. It sent radio signals haywire. The shockwaves travelled the Earth's crust 3 times and were measured on seismographs. You waited 3 weeks before you reassured anybody? What was going on then? And secondly, they're saying, milk's safe. We'll give you ample warning if there's any problem. But, it will help you if the need arises, but I'm sure it won't do. But 3 weeks earlier, they'd had this meeting in which they'd said the cloud is coming over Britain. It may have more or less radioactive content in it, but it's coming over Britain. We don't need to tell anybody about it. There seems to be this great clash, Chris, between what they eventually tell people and what they secretly were worried about. And I'm desperate to know what happened in those 3 weeks, aren't you?
Yeah, and I think it's one of the really interesting things about how this uncertainty is exploited for political purposes. And that's something that a lot of nuclear historians, Bo Jacobs, who's written his book, Global Hibakusha is the term for the bomb-affected people of Japan. And I think that's a wonderful term actually to think about in relation to the fallout from the Tsar Bomba. In the sense that we know that it's global, we know that it's worldwide. But yeah, I think it's really interesting when you look at the document, and the person who's convening the meeting, Charles Hill, is a very interesting figure himself. He was known as Dr. Hill. He was a radio broadcaster, and he was absolutely instrumental in running a counter-campaign on behalf of the Macmillan government against the campaign for nuclear disarmament. So there are these tactics that precede this, that John has touched upon, where any information about fallout is being suppressed. And part of that suppression actually goes back to the British bomb itself, where they're trying to actually get their own policy, politically supported by suppressing information about fallout from originally the Lucky Dragon incident in 1954. So there's a context there that this seems to build on about keeping it hushed up. We could say the same about the Windscale disaster as well. And we know that fallout from that disaster was localized, but was denied by government officials until actually I think some television producers went up there and actually milked a cow within the vicinity of the power plant, and invited some politicians into the studio, and then ran a Geiger counter over the milk pail, and in front of a politician denying any local fallout, this Geiger counter was madly clicking. So these were the kind of tactics that were going on. And yeah, it suited the government to keep it quiet, partly because they just didn't understand what they were dealing with. The kind of advances in science and technology we're talking about here, and the kind of power destruction we're talking about, exploded political institutions. Political institutions had to remake themselves to actually understand the gravity and the breadth of concerns that these kind of events were raising. You've got to bear in mind that this is 10 years before the United Nations Environmental Programme was set up, dealing with transboundary acid rain. So an environmental moment on this kind of magnitude, British politics at that time was ill-adapted to respond to, I think.
Yeah, I think it's worth bearing in mind as well that Tsar Bomba was 16 times bigger than our biggest weapon, which had been Grapple-White. It was detonated 3 years previously. That was 3 megatons. So they had literally just blown us off the table, and we probably didn't want to acknowledge it too much, I would have thought. Alice, it seems to be your sort of area of expertise, how some of this stuff is being dealt with in public and so on. So can you talk a bit about the last part of this document? Because there's a proposed statement they want to make to the public, or there's the suggestion of a statement to the public, and they have a pretty clear idea. This person, Charles Hill, apparently is a DJ in charge of propaganda to some extent, has the committee that he leads has some fairly certain ideas about what this government statement should or shouldn't say.
Yeah, definitely. It is another striking example of very careful framing, and how the way that they shape and narrate that knowledge does then dictate general understanding. And yeah, I think it's really interesting as well that just any kind of recognition of the individuals involved has been removed. It is very much focused on the big picture, and the general risk, and there's no recognition of precautions taken for the people who are flying these planes, testing after, even just who they are. So you see again that visibility taken away from the people who tangibly interacted with these nuclear weapons. So yeah, kind of the way that the government actively control the scope of what we recognise as nuclear knowledge and what is recorded as nuclear history through these kind of careful statements, careful archival recording. And that's why it's been so hard for the veterans to gain visibility and progress for so long, because they have just consistently been wiped out of the records.
So the document makes it clear that a plane, as a flight, has been sent to track the cloud and is taking samples from it, which therefore means it is obviously inside the cloud. No concern about who it might be. And the only suggestion I've ever found about what might have gone on there is one reference to something called Operation Dragnet. And if we ever get enough information on it to do a podcast episode, we will. But at the moment, this is literally it. We know that Operation Dragnet took place. It was 61-62. They were flying through Soviet clouds, and there was more than one. And the only mention of it appears to be in an atomic weapons establishment file known as the Blue Books, which records radiation doses for various troops during the course of our nuclear weapons tests, including sampling of foreign testing. Now, when we've asked the Ministry of Defence about this and questions have been asked in Parliament, the answer has come back, well, we don't have any information about it, which is exactly what they originally said about everything on the Merlin database, it might be pointed out. So maybe this is Operation Dragnet. Maybe there are other sampling missions that went through this cloud or similar clouds that came over from Soviet airspace. We don't really know, but it's one of those things, like you say, Alice, that the government has controlled the narrative for so long, and they still are to some extent. And maybe perhaps now it's too late for them to even remember what the narrative was and why they directed it this way in the first place, but it's the one they seem to be sticking to. So they just suggest they're going to make this written answer in the House of Lords, and it should be distributed widely but unostentatiously, John, as you said, through the normal channels, and there may be, if it's needed, we'll have a plan for a special distribution of a statement to selected outlets other than the press. I don't know what selected outlets other than the press there may have been in 1961. They didn't have Twitter at the time, but clearly the press are not to be trusted because they will be tending to invite ministers to drink cups of radioactive milk and so on live on air, and that kind of thing doesn't make us too many friends, I would have thought. John, I mean, how did the British public respond to all this sort of stuff? Do we know?
Good question. Yeah, I mean, so in my book, British Nuclear Culture, I spent quite a lot of time looking at press, the national press, and how people responded that way. I think that there's a real mixture, and a lot of nuclear scholarship kind of picks up on the sort of ambiguity, the sort of different responses people had. There's plenty of evidence of people being very worried, and a level of what we might call a sort of nuclear anxiety about what was going on during the Cold War era. But also, there's plenty of evidence that points the other way, that actually people weren't too concerned. So, we might look to levels of anti-nuclear activism, for example. Quite healthy numbers came through CND from the late 50s onwards, but then this fell away until the 1980s. So there's real sort of peaks and troughs through the Cold War. But there wasn't too much response to the Tsar Bomba. I think there was so much going on at the time as well, and of course Cuba followed the year later. There seems to be a continue and Bay of Pigs beforehand as well. So it's almost like a sort of continual set of events that I think just almost becomes quite normalised within the Cold War era. So that would be my sort of quick response to that. And actually, Chris, sorry.
Sorry, it's just that sounds really familiar, just constant political chaos and churn, and that you're stuck and going, what's happened now?
Yeah. And actually, Chris, we were going to ask you, because we're sort of winding up, I suppose, for this episode, how because this is one small document in a way, isn't it? It's a short one-page report, essentially. So how do you think this adds to our understanding of the nuclear arms race and the Cold War more generally?
I think it supplements our understanding, and I think it gives an insight, particularly into the history of the British nuclear state within a wider Cold War context. Historians have long written about the planetary nature of fallout with a focus on Tsar Bomba. That's something we know already. What we don't know, and perhaps what this document sheds a light on, is some of the more localized responses and how they might fit in with political cultures and political responses to nuclear events. And that's what we can see here. It's in keeping, I think, with a tradition of secrecy that has shaped most Cold War states, but in the British case takes on a particular flavour. So, what you mentioned about the document and the timing of the release and so on. If we actually think about the history of the British nuclear programme, of course, it has its roots in the Manhattan Project and is based at Chalk River in Canada. After that, it sort of carries on secretly, but an explicit decision to continue the programme. Nuclear energy always is a priority of the government. And in focusing on nuclear energy, I think that Labour government, the post-war Labour government, the Attlee government, is always intending to develop nuclear weapons, but makes an explicit decision in around 1946 and 1947. Very similar situation where the Minister of Defence, I think it's A.V. Alexander, gets up and makes a one-line statement saying, we're developing nuclear weapons, we're developing an atomic bomb. And there's a D notice that goes out. Journalists can't really comment on it. They're only allowed to actually report the factual statements. So from the very beginning, there's not actually a discussion about whether we should have this damn thing with a British Union Jack over the bomb, as Ernest Bevin put it. And then the Labour government do a wonderful job in hiding all of the budget. They set up secret cabinet committees. Winston Churchill can't believe it. Like when he comes back into power, he really wonders, how they've actually done this. There's an interesting sort of development with the Bravo tests, which Castle Bravo was, of course, one of the largest American tests, which exceeded its fallout limits and irradiated the Japanese fishing crew Lucky Dragon. That was, I think, a moment very similar to this one, which preceded it. Ironically, I've written a little bit about the British government's response to that. And that was under Churchill. And at that point, we weren't planning. We had the atomic bomb, which we'd first of all detonated in Australia in October 1952. But we weren't necessarily planning on developing a hydrogen or thermonuclear weapon at that point. Winston Churchill surprisingly responds at that point. Actually, the BBC better get their act together on this and actually make a statement. We need to actually have more urgency on this, because if these bombs keep getting exponentially bigger, there are planetary and international risks which we haven't actually accounted for. So Winston Churchill actually says we need to go public on this. But then
journalist, you can't. This is journalist. You can't win if you do, and you can't win if you don't. There's no happy medium to keep politicians happy.
No, exactly. And I think the journalists at the time end up getting very confused about it because they don't know how to respond. One scientist, Joseph Rotblat, actually, he goes on to BBC Panorama at the request of the government and says, look, yes, Castle Bravo was a much bigger bomb, but, heat went up by a factor of 1,000, blast factor of 1,000, but radioactive fallout the same. He later meets a Japanese physicist who says, no, that's wrong. So the statement he gives on Panorama is wrong. And he then asks the British government if he can go back on, by which time the British government is actually deciding that it wants to develop a thermonuclear weapon. And they say, no, he's blackballed from speaking in public. Then you have this chain of events, which is all about suppression and secrecy, leading up to the Tsar Bomba. So it tells us about how the British state handles the situation. And, with one eye on our veterans and what they've had to go through, it sets the precedent from which everything else has kind of emanated. So, in conclusion, I think the two strands of this, one of which is a global environmental strand, which has been written about by the likes of Bo Jacobs in his Global of Action and Toshihiro Higuchi in Political Fallout. Toshihiro Higuchi, his book is excellent, and he actually says the Limited Test Ban Treaty wasn't just a disarmament treaty, it's a global environmental treaty, because everybody realized that all of these radionuclides that were circulating were harmful. And, there were scientific tests throughout the 1950s, Operation Sunset, where femurs were taken from young babies and tested for levels of strontium-90. Forensic scientists, apparently in the 1950s and 60s, could start to distinguish between pre-atomic and post-atomic man, simply because of the levels of strontium-90 that were in the bones and teeth of the latter, and that helped them to age and date, give an age range of certain corpses when they were forensically testing them. There was that, and then there was the secrecy, which I think directly links to what's happened to the veterans, because it embedded that and compounded that political culture, which we're probably all too familiar with.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you very much, Chris. So I think we're coming to the end of this episode. So thanks so much to Alice and Chris for coming along and sharing your reflections on that source. And thank you, Alice, for being one of our student volunteers. This project would be impossible without you. And you'll be continuing work, I think, for at least another month or so on the project. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, and I just want to briefly say some of the health effects that are reported after Tsar Bomba. There was no fallout found on the ground almost straight afterwards when people went in to test things very soon afterwards. But that doesn't mean there wasn't any, of course. It disappeared somewhere else. In all, there were 224 nuclear weapons detonated in that region. 95% of children in that area are underdeveloped. There's high rates of thyroid cancer, birth defects, leukemias are very common. The glaciers around Novaya Zemlya are 130 times more radioactive than they should be. And it's a similar kind of pattern that we've seen in our own nuclear veterans and nuclear veterans in America and in Algeria and in China and all around the world. They tell a very, very similar story.
Okay. So thanks very much once again. In the next few episodes, we'll be discussing the Merlin project in further detail. We have a number of episodes coming up, don't we, Susie? Including one on Joseph Rotblat and Liverpool. I think that's on the list, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, hope maybe we'll get Chris back on to talk about that. He's being an expert, because there was a lot of connections with the University of Liverpool back in the early days of the bomb project. So we've been discussing how the cover-up began, the legal tussles with the government, with the database, and some of the people who were involved in that first legal case. So some pretty grisly human experiments as well, which the British government was part of. So come back for some of those in the next few weeks.
Yeah, thank you for listening.
This podcast series is part of the Nuclear Justice Research Project based at the University of Liverpool. Funded by Research England's Policy Fund, the project is a collaboration between the Centre for People's Justice and the Department of History, investigative reporter Susie Boniface, and Lab Rats International. All historic images are Crown copyright and reproduced under the Open Government Licence. With thanks to Dr Jonathan Hogg, Susie Boniface, Sarah-Jayne Stroud, Michael Bayliss, and the team of students.